On December 12, 1928, a small plane spotted something floating in the Colorado River. It was a boat. It was perfectly intact, fully stocked with supplies, drifting like a ghost ship through the Grand Canyon. The rope was still coiled, the food was still fresh, even the winter coats were neatly folded inside. The only thing missing? The passengers. This find has marked a beginning of one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Be sure to stay until the end because this story has so many twists and unexpected turns that I can easily mark it as one of the most unusual stories I've ever told or heard of. But before we dive in, if you love the stories about the unexplained, forgotten and twisted, you're in the right place because every week we release 1 or 2 full-length episodes plus 5 to 7 shorts that dig into even deeper and stranger corners of history. So don't forget to lightly tap the like button, hit subscribe, and turn on all notifications to stay in tune with our weekly drops. Alright, here we go. Glen Hyde stood at the rail of a passenger ship cutting through the Pacific toward Los Angeles, watching the sunset paint the ocean gold. The year was 1927 and Glen was a 29-year-old farmer from Twin Falls, Idaho, and there was something restless in him, something that couldn't be satisfied by simply plowing fields. The year before, he had built his own boat and traveled the Salmon River and Snake Rivers, some of the most dangerous waters in Idaho. The rush of conquering those rapids had awakened something wild in him. That's when he saw her, Bessie Haley. She was sketching something on the upper deck of the ship with her dark hair catching the wind. She was 22, an artist from West Virginia with what people called a bohemian spirit. She wrote poetry, she acted in theater, and technically, she was still married to a man named Earl Helmick, back in West Virginia. But when Glen approached her and they started talking, something electric passed between them. By the time ship docked in Los Angeles, they were inseparable. Bessie wasn't some delicate flower. She had already left one husband after just 2 months of marriage and traveled alone to San Francisco to study art. In 1927, that took serious courage for women. She was looking for adventure, for something more than the conventional life waiting for her back in Parkersburg, a small rural town in West Virginia. And Glen had a dream. Not just any dream, a dream that would soon make them both famous. On April 10th, 1928, in Twin Falls, Idaho, Glen and Bessie stood before Justice of the Peace. It was exactly 1 day after Bessie's divorce from Earl Helmick had been finalized. 1 day. That's how eager they were to start their life together. But this wouldn't be an ordinary honeymoon. Glen had explained his plan probably over their wedding dinner. Only 45 people had ever successfully run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. 45. And not a single woman. The Colorado River in 1928 wasn't what it would become decades later. There were no commercial tours, no safety regulations, no rescue teams waiting if something went wrong. The rapids were wild, unmapped in places, and absolutely lethal. Professional expeditions with full crews and safety equipment regularly ended in disaster. Glen's plan was to do it in a homemade wooden scow. Basically a small flat-bottomed barge. No life jackets, no radio, just the two of them against 270 miles of the most dangerous waters in America. If they succeeded, Bessie would be the first woman to conquer the Grand Canyon by river, and Glen would set a new speed record. They would return as celebrities. Book deals, speaking tours, their faces in every newspaper in America. They would never have to worry about money again. If they succeeded. The scow Glen had built sat in the water like a wooden coffin. It was 20 feet long, flat-bottomed, and designed for the rivers of Idaho, not the violence of the Colorado. The name Glen had given to his ship was Rain in the Face, to symbolize their courage and endurance in the face of adversity. Their goal was to reach the town of Needles, California by early December, 6 weeks to run the entire canyon. The first days of their trip went better than expected. Bessie's journal showed her excitement. October 23rd, ran Cataract Canyon today. Glen says we're making excellent time. October 28th, the walls are higher than any building I've seen. It's like being swallowed by the earth. But then something happened. The exact timing was unclear, but somewhere in those first 2 weeks, Glen fell out of the boat in the rapid. He made it back, but now both of them knew. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the river would take them. By November 15th, they'd been on river for 26 days. They were battered, exhausted, and probably sick of each other's company. Every rapid was a dice roll with death. They needed supplies, and they needed a break. That's when they decided to make a quick pause in their trip. They climbed out at the Bright Angel Trail. In the middle of November of 1928, Emery Kolb heard a knock on his studio door. He and his brother Ellsworth were legends, photographers who'd been documenting the canyon for decades. When he opened the door, he saw a young couple, sunburned and weather-beaten. Glen introduced them as the Hydes and explained they were running the river and had been out here for 26 days. Emery invited them in. As they talked, Emery noticed some things about them. Small things, but important. First, they had no life preservers. Glen laughed when Emery asked about them. They didn't need them, he insisted. They could swim anything the river threw at them. The second thing Emery noticed, Bessie seemed different. Tired, yes, but there was something else about her. Emery would later say she seemed apprehensive, like she didn't want to go back into the canyon. At one point, Bessie looked at Emery's young daughter Emily, who was dressed in a pretty dress and shiny shoes. Bessie stared at her for a long moment. "I wonder," Bessie said quietly, "if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." This was supposed to be her honeymoon, the adventure of a lifetime, and she was wondering if she ever wear pretty shoes again. Before the Hydes left, Emery took their photograph. Glen stood tall and confident. Bessie stood beside him, forcing a smile. Of course, nobody knew it back then, but that would be the last known photograph ever taken of them together. 2 days later, on November 18, a friend of the Kolbs, Adolf Sutra, decided to ride with the Hydes for a few miles down the river. He wanted to see how they handled the scow. They seemed skilled and confident, and he got out a few miles down the river at Hermit Rapid. On December 1st, 1928, in Needles, California, Glen's father, Rollin Hyde, was pacing in his living room. His son and new daughter-in-law should have arrived by now. Should have been 3 days ago, actually, if Glen had met his schedule. But then, December 6th came and went, then December 10th, there was still no word from either Glen or Bessie. Rollin Hyde was 70 years old, but he didn't hesitate. He contacted Emery Kolb, the photographer, begging him to find his son. On December 19th, a search plane roared through the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon. The pilot was scanning the river, trying to see anything, any sign of the missing couple. And then he saw something. Around mile 237, it was the scow. The scow was floating in a calm river, turning in lazy circles. The rescue team was immediately dispatched to the area, and when they reached the boat, what they found made no sense at all. The boat was upright, perfectly intact, not a plank out of place. All the supplies were still strapped down, food, water, camping gear, everything. Their winter coats were inside, folded neatly, which was really unusual. December winter is cold in Grand Canyon. Glen's gun was still in his holster in the boat. Wrapped in oilcloth was Bessie's journal. The tow rope was underwater, caught on something, so Emery Kolb took out his knife and cut it. a decision he'd be criticized for later for possibly destroying evidence. On the gunwale, they counted 42 notches. A gunwale is a top edge of the hull of the boat, and each notch on the Glen scow represented one day. So 42 notches meant 42 days of the journey. But Glen and Bessie Hyde, gone. Vanished without a trace. Bessie's journal became the only witness to their final days. The investigators read it like a crime scene. November 20th, made good time through Granite Rapids. November 23rd, Glen says we're ahead of schedule. November 28th, camped at Diamond Creek. The stars here are like nothing I've ever seen. And then came November 30th, the final entry. She wrote that they'd successfully ran mile 231 rapid. They were almost home, less than 50 miles from the end of their journey. After that entry, nothing. The search teams worked backwards from where the boat was found. They scoured every beach, every side canyon, every possible path out of the gorge. They brought in Native American trackers. They searched caves. They dragged sections of the river. Glen's father hired his own search parties. He offered rewards. He posted missing person notices across the Southwest. All of those efforts returned nothing. And as it often happens in cases like this, the disappearance of the young couple gave birth to rumors and largely unsubstantiated theories. The first theory was the obvious one: they drowned. They were thrown from the boat around mile 232 rapid, a section of the river that wasn't even mapped in 1928. The rapids there hit granite boulders just below the surface, and locals called it a boat killer. But if they drowned, where were their bodies? The Colorado usually gave up its dead within days. And why was the boat in perfect condition with no visible signs of damage? The second popular theory, and the one that Glen's father believed, was they made it to the shore but died trying to hike out for some reason. But searchers found no tracks leading away from the river, no abandoned gear, no signs that anyone had tried to climb those canyon walls. And the theory 3, the most ominous one, murder. But who and why? They were alone in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Or were they? For 43 years, the disappearance of Glen and Bessie Hyde remained a mystery. It became legend, the kind of story river guides told around campfires. The honeymoon couple who vanished into the canyon and never came back. Then something happened that changed everything. In 1971, during a commercial rafting trip down the Colorado River, a group of tourists was taking night break on the bank of the river. The group sat around the campfire and the guide was telling the old stories. Naturally, eventually he got to Glen and Bessie Hyde. And that's when one of the passengers, an elderly woman, spoke up. "I'm Bessie Hyde." The entire group went silent. George Billingsley, one of the river guides, thought she was joking, so he said, "What did you do with Glen?" he asked. The woman looked at him. "I killed him," she said, calmly, without any indication of a joke. For the next few seconds, nobody spoke, and the only thing breaking the silence was the crackling of the fire and the quiet hum of the running river. Then she continued. They'd been fighting. Glen had become abusive and controlling. He wouldn't let her leave the river even though she was terrified, exhausted, and quite frankly, done with his dream. So one night, she stabbed him and pushed his body into the river. Then she hiked out to Peach Springs, Arizona, a journey, by the way, that would have taken days through some of the harshest terrain in America. She caught a bus back east and started a new life. Then for 43 years, she'd been living under the name of Elizabeth Cutler. The story exploded across the Southwest. Newspapers picked it up, investigators reopened the case. They tracked down Elizabeth Cutler, now a retired psychology professor from Ohio, and that's when things really got weird. Cutler denied everything. She said she never made the confession, never even heard of Glen and Bessie Hyde until reporters started calling. But multiple witnesses on that river trip swore they heard her say it. swore they heard her confess to murder. Naturally, investigators checked her background and found out that she was born on December 2nd, 1908, which would have made her 3 years younger than Bessie. She was also 4 inches taller. Birth records confirmed she really was Elizabeth Cutler from Pomeroy, Ohio. Case closed? Not quite. Elizabeth Cutler was also a psychology professor, a woman known for, as one person put it, playing mind games with people. So did she just make up the confession for attention? For the thrill of it? Or was she telling the truth and then got scared when the authorities came knocking? Elizabeth Cutler died in 1998, taking her secrets with her. But the story only got stranger. In 1976, 5 years after Elizabeth Cutler's confession, workers were cleaning out Emery Kolb's boathouse. Remember, he was the photographer who took the last picture of Glen and Bessie. Hidden in an old canoe, wrapped in canvas, they found a skeleton. A human skeleton, male, with a bullet hole in the skull. The rumors exploded immediately. It was Glen Hyde, it had to be. Emery Kolb had killed him, maybe because he wanted Bessie for himself, maybe because Glen threatened him, maybe for reasons that would never be known. That's why Kolb was so quick to join the search party. That's why he cut the boat rope, potentially to hide or destroy some evidence. Forensic anthropologists examined the skeleton. Forensic anthropologists are the professionals who apply their knowledge of human skeletal anatomy, primarily focusing on the analysis of human remains. So what they did is they superimposed photographs of Glen's face over the skull, and it wasn't him. The skull shape was wrong. The cheekbones were too wide, the chin was too square, plus the forensics suggested that the person died in 1980s, not in 1928. But then, whose skeleton was hidden in Emery Kolb's boathouse? Another mystery on top of a mystery. The story should have ended here, an unsolved mystery frozen in time. But soon, it took one more incredible turn. In May of 1992 died Georgie Clark. She was a legend in Grand Canyon rafting, the first woman to run the canyon commercially, a pioneer who paved the way for thousands of others. Her friends gathered at her house after the funeral. For most of them, it was their first time inside her house. Georgie had been private like that. As they went through her belongings, they found something that stopped them cold. In her desk drawer was a gun. More specifically, a Colt pistol from the 1920s. That by itself would not have been an unusual find had it not been for the second discovery. In her filing cabinet, they found a marriage certificate for Glen and Bessie Hyde. And then the real shock. Her real name wasn't Georgie Clark. It wasn't even Georgie White, which was another name she used sometimes. Her real name? Bessie DeRoss. Bessie. Not a most common name in those years. Could Georgie Clark have been Bessie Hyde all along? Living in plain sight? Running the very river she supposedly died on? The investigators looked at photographs, compared faces across decades, and no. Georgie Clark and Bessie Hyde looked nothing alike. Different bone structure, different height, different everything. The marriage certificate, probably a souvenir picked up from some collector or maybe even found on the river. The name coincidence? Just that, a coincidence. And that gun? No connection to the case. Another dead end. What really held an answer to what happened to Glen and Bessie Hyde was most probably Mile 232 Rapid. In 1928, this rapid didn't appear on any maps. River runners didn't know it existed until they were already in it. And by then, it was too late. Mile 232 was a killer because the river narrowed suddenly, forcing all that water through a channel maybe 30 feet wide. The current accelerated to nearly 30 miles per hour. But the deadly part was the giant granite boulders, some the size of the house, that sat just below the surface. Runners couldn't see them until the impact. The local river runners had a saying, "Mile 232 has killed more boats than any other rapid in the canyon." River historian Otis Marston studied the Hyde case for decades. His conclusion was that Glen and Bessie hit those submerged rocks. The impact threw them from the boat. The scow, being flat-bottomed and sturdy, bounced off and continued downstream. Glen and Bessie, thrown into that freezing violent water, didn't stand a chance. No life jackets. November water temperatures are barely above freezing. Current moving so fast they couldn't swim against it. Canyon walls were so steep they couldn't have climbed out even if they had reached them. They would have had maybe 3 minutes before hypothermia took them. 3 minutes in a dark, cold violence of the Colorado River. Their bodies probably pinned under one of those granite boulders, held down by tons of water pressure. Some bodies stayed trapped underwater for years. Some were never found at all. But there was one more piece of evidence. One final twist of the story that didn't fit any theory. In the weeks after Glen and Bessie disappeared, a river runner named James Irvin came forward. He said he'd been on the river around the same time the Hydes vanished. And he saw something. A brown leather jacket floating in the river near mile 232. Bessie Hyde wore a brown leather jacket. But there was a problem. If Bessie drowned without her jacket on, why wasn't it in a boat with their other neatly folded belongings? If she was wearing it when she went into the water, how and why did it come off? The Colorado River in November, nobody would take off their jacket. They'd need every layer they had. Unless she wasn't in the water. Unless she took it off for another reason. There probably was another logical explanation to their discovery, but no one was able to conclusively explain that find. There was one more person who might have had answers, but he took them to his grave. Earl Helmick, Bessie's first husband. Bessie's brother would later tell investigators that Helmick had a violent temper, that there were some people who thought Helmick might have been involved in Glen and Bessie's disappearance. His wife had left him after 2 months of marriage, divorced him and married another man the next day, then went off on this grand adventure that would make her famous. Did Helmick follow them into the canyon? It sounded impossible, but people had done crazier things for revenge. Helmick remarried in 1930, and until his death in 1970s, he refused to discuss Bessie. Not a word. Even when reporters came calling after the story became famous, he wouldn't talk about her. Grief? Guilt? Nobody would ever know. So what really happened to Glen and Bessie Hyde? After all the investigations, all the confessions, all the evidence, 3 possibilities remained. Possibility 1, accidental drowning. They hit mile 232 rapid, were thrown from the boat and drowned in the freezing water, their bodies forever pinned by the rocks somewhere at the bottom of the Colorado River. Simple, tragic, mundane. The river killed them like it had killed others before and since. Possibility 2, murder, suicide. The pressure, the fear, the exhaustion finally broke one of them. Maybe Glen snapped and hurt Bessie. Then, after realizing what he had done, took his own life. Maybe Bessie, desperate and terrified, pushed Glen overboard and then, what? Walked into the desert to die? The journal and Bessie's comments showed they were struggling. Remember her remark, "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." But if the murder-suicide theory is true, then where were their bodies? Possibility 3, Bessie's escape. Bessie killed Glen either in self-defense or desperation and escaped the canyon, started a new life somewhere. The Elizabeth Cutler confession was real, but she got scared and recanted. Or maybe Bessie became someone else entirely, someone never connected to the case. She was a free spirit, so this is quite a reasonable possibility. But there was a 4th theory. One that investigators didn't like to talk about because it made the least sense and yet explained the most. What if they both made it out? What if the whole thing was staged? They were almost broke. The trip was supposed to make them rich and famous, but what if near the end they realized it wouldn't be enough? Just being the first woman to run the canyon in 1928, that might get a few newspaper articles, maybe a small book deal, but not the fortune they dreamed of. But disappearing? Vanishing mysteriously in the Grand Canyon? That would make them legendary. That would make them immortal. That would make hundreds of investigators and YouTubers want to talk about them some 100 years later. They could have hiked out at Diamond Creek. It was one of the few places where it was possible. Stage the boat to drift downstream, leave the state or even country under new names, and start new life somewhere. The boat would be found, they'd be declared dead, and they'd be free. Except would anyone abandon everything? Family, identity, entire life for that? Would they let Glen's father, Rollin Hyde, spend decades until his final days desperately searching? We just don't know. Today, if someone took a rafting trip through the Grand Canyon, their guide would probably tell them about Glen and Bessie Hyde. They'd point at mile 232 and say, that's where it happened. They'd show pictures of the young couple, frozen in time, forever 29 and 22 years old. Some guides would say that on quiet nights people could hear Bessie's voice echoing of the canyon walls. Somewhere in that vast expanse of rock and river, the truth about Glen and Bessie Hyde remained hidden. Maybe their bones rested under a boulder in mile 232. Maybe they were buried in some side canyon no one had ever searched. Or maybe, just maybe, Glen and Bessie Hyde lived to be an old couple, reading about their own disappearance in newspapers, taking their secret to a grave under another name. The Colorado River had revealed many of its victims over the years. Bodies lost for decades suddenly surfaced. Boats, though destroyed, emerged from the sand, but Glen and Bessie Hyde, the river never gave them back. Almost 100 years had passed since that December day when their empty boat was found floating like a ghost ship through the Grand Canyon. 100 years of searches, investigations, confessions, and theories. And still, the only witness of what really happened on November 30th, 1928 was the canyon itself. And the canyon wasn't talking. Did Bessie ever got to wear pretty shoes again? Nobody would ever know. If you enjoyed today's story and want more tales of the unexplained, forgotten, and twisted, hit the like and subscribe. Your support means everything as we grow this new channel. We got 3 to 5 shorts and 1 or even 2 deep dive long videos coming every week, so there's always something twisted and bizarre waiting for you here. Let me know your thoughts on today's story in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.